So thanks for joining me. I'm joined today by Michael Lens. Dr. Lens is an associate professor of urban planning and public policy at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Policy and an associate faculty director of the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. Dr. Lens and I have had the opportunity to work together a little bit before when I was at UCLA, and his research and mine overlap a little bit. He studies policy solutions to housing market inequities and how inequality in the housing market, like segregation, eviction, schools, and housing supply, can lead to negative outcomes for families that are low income and for people of color. So thanks for joining me today, Dr. Lens. I am really excited about getting your expert take on some of these housing market factors that are involved with how COVID-19 is unfolding in the United States.
My pleasure. Great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. So let's dive right in. We have seen in the news that one of the earliest hotspots in the United States for COVID-19 was in New York City. And I have observed, especially coming from Los Angeles to Wisconsin, that we very often think of urban and rural as binary. You know, it's either urban or it's rural. And I've seen some commentators say things that are kind of implying that the population density is the reason for those hotspots to have emerged. And I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about what factors related to housing put certain neighborhoods at risk in New York City in terms of being early on in the outbreak.
Yeah, I think I often like to separate density and crowding in housing, right? And these things can certainly be related, right? But density has more specifically to do with how many people live per square mile, right? And overcrowding is crowding is like how many people per room in a housing unit. And these things are certainly related, in very, sometimes in dense urban environments, you have people living more people living in smaller spaces. And I certainly don't think that we know enough about either factor in COVID transmission to kind of make definitive claims about, should we be worried about density in urban areas from a public health perspective, or should we be, I think we should always be worried about overcrowding from a public health perspective.
And I guess I should say, I know you don't study pandemics in general, right. So, but I do, when you look at the neighborhoods that were early on, they weren't the most densely populated neighborhoods. It wasn't Manhattan that kicked off first. It was really Queens and Brooklyn. So I think that's an interesting point.
Yeah, and I think, it certainly, as this disease has spread throughout the country, you certainly you certainly can find countless examples of not particularly dense urban or rural environments where there have been hotspots. And one thing that I think we keep seeing is institutionalized populations, right? Whether that's jails and prisons, of which this country has more per capita than anywhere in the world, and also nursing home settings, right? And those places are not typically, they're not typically found certainly jails and prisons are not found in dense parts of central cities or in major cities. And the transmission does not have anything to do with the built environment from whence they come or from whence their family members who may visit come, right? So, I think certainly as the disease has spread throughout the country, we're seeing lots of places, like Phoenix right now, which is a very car-dominated environment. It's, not densely populated. It has a lot of people, but spread out over vast geographic space. And there are clearly other factors at play in transmitting that virus to
Yeah.
a lot of people.
Yeah. So what are some of the housing policies that you see as playing an important role in terms of how the pandemic unfolds? And I'm also wondering if there are policies that you think are part of the solution in terms of recovery and supporting especially communities of color.
Yeah, so, I think like the kind of public health connection to housing, is certainly a little less connected to my expertise. And, again, I think that, as far as like how we build our cities with a pandemic or public health mindset, again, I think is still yet to be determined. The main things I worry about from a housing perspective right now are the very short and immediate term losses of income that people have, and the fact that they were already very tenuously housed. There are a lot of people, especially where I live in coastal California, that were spending huge amounts of their money on rent, and therefore were, the loss of one paycheck or two paychecks away from being foreclosed on, or in many more cases being evicted. That, we have had some very short-term policy interventions, both in kind of unemployment support and income support, and also like eviction moratoria. But there's not a great answer across the country, or even in most jurisdictions, about what happens when the eviction moratoria are lifted and people are still, and we're still struggling at 20% unemployment and people are still not able to pay, right? Eviction moratoria did not really in any cases cancel the rent or lower the rent, right? There are some programs of rent forgiveness or assistance to landlords, extra assistance to renters. But again, those are kind of patchwork solutions that have been rolled out in just some places. So the more immediate term issue is definitely going to be keeping people housed and keeping people where they were without, people going completely into debt or losing their savings. And then, I think in the kind of longer term horizon, I think, we can't, speaking particularly as somebody living in Los Angeles, like we came into COVID with a very dramatic housing crisis, particularly on the rental side. And we haven't really fixed the kind of systemic problems there.
Yeah. I really worry a lot about the cyclical nature of crowding being a risk factor for the pandemic, and crowding and institutionalization also being a product of people losing their homes. I think certainly I know one of the Dear Pandemic collaborators works with a homeless shelter, and they're really struggling because it's a very difficult place to manage an epidemic. And I worry a lot about those things kind of feeding back into each other.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, early on in March, in Los Angeles, I think the city, largely started scrambling. They made a stay-at-home order, and then were faced with the problem where there's 60 to 70,000 people on any one night in LA County that don't have a home to stay at. And
right.
so one kind of quick solution was to use public places like community rec centers and gyms to house people. Well, that's not a good place because you've got 20 people in a not particularly ventilated space, right?
Yeah.
And so there's trailers, and there's a lot of different ways to try to thread that needle. But then, what happens when, those orders have certainly been relaxed already, but then how do you unwind, I think particularly in the LA homelessness crisis, like how are we going to unwind some of the, again, patchwork supports that we put in place? But, they had a goal of putting 15,000 people into hotels. They, I think, housed something like 3,000 after months of work on that. And so, like, even the things that they scrambled to do, they didn't do to the extent that they initially planned.
So one of the things that one of the overlaps in our work is looking at home ownership and families of color and wealth accumulation. And we saw after the Great Recession that in the foreclosure crisis that families of color were the most at risk for losing the wealth that they had accumulated in terms of equity in their homes. What do you see as as a totally leading question, but do you see that as being a big problem in this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, there's been, several waves of injustice, particularly targeting, I would say, African Americans, but not just African Americans. As this last 3 months or so have unfolded, right? We came to see rather early on that Black people were disproportionately, obviously, infected with COVID, and we, obviously spent the last 3 or 4 weeks, working like heck to understand and deal with the crisis of American policing and the violence inflicted from that. And then, like, you mentioned, like, wealth loss during the Great Recession, and, coming in the recovery of the last eight or so years coming out of the Great Recession, it was also the, blackest and brownest parts of American metropolitan areas that saw the slowest gains back to, the kind of 2007 levels of housing wealth and value. So that's another hole that they were already, that Black and brown communities were already in. And, a lot of the eviction and homelessness crises that I was talking about before, which, is largely informed by, my knowledge of Los Angeles, but not entirely. That's a very disproportionate Black and brown problem. Whether you're looking at eviction, eviction, the disproportionate effect, particularly on Black women, Black mothers, is a nationwide, well understood nationwide phenomenon at this point. In Los Angeles, something like 9% of the population identifies as African American, and 40% of the homelessness population identifies as African American. So some of these very acute rental problems, rental affordability problems, at the very, that have like the biggest impact on people's lives and outcomes are clearly, disproportionately borne by Black households and households of color more generally.
Yeah, and there are good historical reasons why that is the case. We have a long history in this country of explicitly racist housing policy that prevented Black Americans from becoming stable homeowners, and those are still affecting families to this day. I'm not telling you that because you know that. I'm telling our viewers. So let's just wrap up with this. This is my last question. If we want to learn more about housing inequality and how it reproduces racism and class structures in the U.S., what resources would you recommend for a beginner? A book or a podcast? Where would we start?
Yeah. I mean, there's, I think like the housing problem at least to me, is very multifaceted, and as you've stressed, has historical roots, right? And when I say multifaceted, like, I think we've failed in housing on multiple fronts, and our housing solutions need to have multiple aspects to them. And I kind of emphasized like the more acute crises of eviction and homelessness, but the fact is, like, we have not, in a lot of places, we just haven't built enough housing of all types. We don't build enough housing, even at market rates. We certainly don't build enough affordable housing, and we certainly don't subsidize people to afford the housing that exists. And so, like, the more, I always encourage people to really kind of not think about one solution in housing or one cause in housing, in our housing problems, but to look at material that kind of treats it as a multifaceted problem. One book that I think is very good at that specific thing is Randy Shaw's Generation Priced Out. It's a very recent book. Shaw is a long time lawyer and advocate in San Francisco, and so he brings a largely a homeless advocate, eviction advocate's perspective. So very humane in his writing and thinking, but also has a very deep policy knowledge that he can connect. That he connects to different locations in the country.
That's great.
Richard,
I haven't read that one.
Yeah, and then more of the history, like Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law.
Yeah, that's a great book.
Is a good option if you want to kind of understand like how race is intertwined in both public, not just private decision making in housing, but very much in public policy over the years, and not just kind of racially explicit public policy, but a lot of kind of colorblind ways that we make policy. And I think, Ta-Nehisi Coates's essay in The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations, is a lot of that is about housing. A lot of the case he makes is that theft of Black wealth and Black income goes back, obviously, like, of course, slavery is the original sin, but this country continued to extract wealth from Black people and Black families and communities long after that went by. Yeah. And
as recently as the mid-2000s with predatory lending, right?
Yeah,
and I'm sure there's an even more recent example.
Absolutely. And so, like, that I think is I don't feel like it got as much, the headline is The Case for Reparations, and that's such a loaded word for so many people.
It's such a loaded word, I know.
Yeah.
But what? I think it's time to put that word on the table. So I appreciate that essay and you suggesting it.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, well, I am going to let you go. Thank you so much for joining us and for educating us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.